Hi there, fourth graders. I hope you had a great day yesterday. Thank you for the lively discussion on Canvas and everyone's hard work. I want to talk for a few minutes today. I want to do some follow up about Stephen. We know that Stephen is Chloe and Violet's oldest brother, and we know that he is not well. So I sent you on a scavenger hunt throughout the text to find every detail about Stephen that we know from inside the Hope Chest and then to talk about it. So let's see what students came up with. So Ian says that Stephen had gone to school and served in the war, and that then he had come home to recover from it. Corver says he went to war and came back, and because he'd seen so many people die, he hasn't talked since. Lexi mentions that he got $500 from his grandma and grandpa and went to school with the money. She also mentions that she went to fight in France against the Germans, um, and that the parlor gets turned into Stephen's recuperation room. Clara mentioned that Stephen just got back from World War One and that Violet's supposed to read to him every night. And then she thinks that Stephen is not well because he had a bad experience and hurt his brain or some part from him and is covering from that. Zach thinks that he got shot, and that's why he's back home. Is he got physically injured? Bowen says hello, hi Bowen. He also says he was in the war. He cannot talk, and he likes the war news. Millie says that she thinks something happened to him in the war, like he got hurt, where it says what is left of him, and that's an interesting use of term, right? To say what is left of somebody shows that something serious happened to them if there's only parts of them left. Um, we'll have to see what they mean by what's left of him. Ezekiel thinks that Stephen's not talking because he thought in the war. Jaden mentions that the parents only care about Steven and not Chloe and Violet, but Chloe and Violet care about Steven too. Sierra says that Steven can't read and he loves books, and that Steven was in the war and that he went to college. Kale thinks that Steven can't read and that Violet reads books to him, the Oz books, and that he got his own recovery room when he came back. And then Violet and Chloe. Yes, I mean brother. Yeah. Stephen. Bennett thinks that Stephen got hurt in the war. I'm gonna use Kenley's slide here in a minute, so we'll go over all those details. Looks like more of the same. Stephen was a soldier. He fought against the Germans. Thanks, Casey. Ooh, Casey's making the inference that he must have gotten really hurt. A great inference there, Casey. Thanks for making that. Kylie, that Stephen had been in the war, $500 for his education. He doesn't really talk much. Stephen was in the army. Lots of details from Harper, so we'll talk about those in a second. So here's the gist of what we know. We know that Violet reads to him. We know that he was a soldier. He likes the news. He used to do stuff with his sister that Chloe would give him newspaper clippings. He studies the wallpaper. He did not have all of them back from the war. He got $500. His mother puts all of his time towards him. He's recovering from the war. The parlor became the recuperation room. His mother would dress him so he could vote. Violet would read to him. Violet thinks that her parents only care about Stephen and that Chloe cares about him and that he is not really there. So there's a lot of small details about Stephen. Let's take a step back and say, what are the big things that we know? Okay, this is what we know. He went to Cornell University, and that's a very normal thing to do for someone when they're a young adult. Now there were several people that mentioned that Stephen can't read, and I want to challenge that assumption because if Stephen has the ability to go to Cornell University, and Cornell is a really high-ranked university, then I would make the inference that he can read. The author doesn't say it explicitly in the text, but I know that people that go to college can read. So my guess is that Stephen can read, which that makes it interesting to see. Okay, if Stephen can read and he can read well enough to get into college, why would he need his 11-year-old sister to read him the Wizard of Oz books? Food for thought, right? Like that would be something that an 11-year-old sister would read their younger brother, not their older brother. We know he went to go fight in World War One. I think it was around the year 19. Actually, it might have been 1917. But he went and he joined Canada to fight with Canadian forces because they joined the war with the British earlier than the Americans did. And then he came home and he needs a recuperation room. Now, to recuperate means to like heal or get better. So we can make the inference there that something's wrong with him, that he got hurt. He spends his day, he stares at wallpaper. Violet reads The Wizards of Oz to him. Um, he um, he can't really dress himself. He talks about how his mom has to dress him. So let's ask this of what got injured. Now, some people, if they get hurt, if they get, a leg cut off or, something else like that, if they get injured badly in the war, they can still talk, they can still read, you know, but it sounds like to me that Stephen just kind of sits there all day and stares. And that's about what his whole life is. So let's talk about, we found out today, finally in today's reading, we found out what's going on with Stephen. Stephen has something that's called shell shock. Shell shock, nowadays we would probably call shell shock PTSD, or post traumatic stress disorder. But in World War One, they didn't really know what shell shock was. What they did know was that in World War One, there were a bunch of soldiers that were experiencing this. They would call it battle fatigue as well, or shell shock. But soldiers that were completely healthy, they didn't have any physical ailments, but yet mentally, they wouldn't be able to sleep at night. They would have traumatic dreams. They would relive events, stressful, horrible things that they've seen kind of over and over again. Um, and they just wouldn't. They wouldn't be. I mean, they were fit physically, but mentally, they weren't fit anymore. And in World War One, 100 years ago, they didn't know what caused it or what it was. They thought it had something to do with artillery shells, so like bombs exploding, how that changes air pressure. They thought it had something to do with that. They thought that it maybe cowards, just soldiers that were cowards got shell shock, um, and so Stephen has shell shock, and Violet and Chloe go out and talk about that in the text today. So that's a bit interesting. That when you think of war, you think of people getting hurt physically, but we learned that Steven wasn't hurt physically. He's completely normal. If you get him dressed, you can take him out to vote. Physically, he's fine, but he had such a traumatic experience fighting in the war that he can't leave it. It's just in his head all day every day. He has a traumatic experience, and that's he just is kind of just vegetative all day, just sitting in the parlor recuperation room. So that's an interesting thing about when I first read the Hope Chest, I thought that he was injured physically. And when students read the Hope Chest, most of the time they think he's injured physically as well. So what many of us have experienced as we've learned and read about Stephen is we've synthesized information. So remember that synthesizing information can come in two ways. The first way is when we learn something new and add it to what we already know. So we're just kind of like building onto our schema or our background knowledge. But there's another kind of synthesized information, which is where we think we know one thing, but then we learn something from details in the text that causes us to shift our information. So think about when the city of Ember, remember when you finally find out that they've actually been underground the whole time and how that shifts your thinking of the whole book? That was a synthesized information because before you assumed that they were above ground. It might not have been something you thought about explicitly, but you assumed it. And then all of a sudden, when you realize, oh, they were underground the whole time, your thinking shifted. Well, many of us thought that Stephen was injured physically from the war, but we might not have assumed that he was injured mentally. That he'd had a traumatic experience and was experiencing shell shock. So that's an example of synthesized information. So for today's assignment, what I want you to do is just tell me just a short paragraph of before we talked about Steven today and we read about it, what did you think was wrong with him before? And then how has your thinking changed now that we've talked about it in this video and that we've had more details that we've read about shell shock in the text? So tell me what your thinking was and then how it changed. And that's all for today's comprehension assignment. So thanks so much for your hard work and let's keep it up. Have a good day. Bye bye. Stop.